Hello and welcome. We're just going to get Jonty to join us. Hello, welcome everybody. Apologies for the slight delay, but I'm delighted to welcome you all to the first Hello Culture in Conversation, which is part of BBC Digital Cities, which this season has gone virtual. My name is Helga Henry. I'm a consultant who works in the creative and cultural industries. And I've been very privileged to have been part of Hello Culture from the very beginning. So I'm delighted to today welcome Jonty Claypole, Director of BBC Arts, and the architect really of what we're going to talk about, the highly successful Culture in Quarantine season. And thank you so much, Jonty, for joining us for the first Hello Culture in Conversation. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Helga.
Brilliant. Before we get started, just a couple of bits of housekeeping. For those of you familiar with Zoom, you may already know the best way to view this webinar is to do that in side-by-side mode. So that means you'll get to the slides and we've got a little clip. You'll see that and both of us. And if I'm pointing to the top of my screen, if you touch the top of the screen, you'll see a thing called View Options. And if you touch or click on that, you should get side-by-side mode. And then you can move those boxes so that you can see us both. We will be recording this session. You'll just see whatever's on the screen now. So you'll be able to watch it again on the Hello Culture website. And closed captions are available for this session. So that will be live subtexting. And if you press again at the bottom of your screen, the CC button, there's an option to view both the full transcript as well as displaying the scrolling subtitles. So CC button down there, and we're good to go. We're going to start with about 35 minutes of chat, and then in the last 20 minutes, we will be going to you to find out your questions and put them to Jonty. So please, at any point, use the chat function, also down here. Use the chat function, and we'll do our best to get through as many as we can in the time. Just by way of context briefly, I often start the Hello Culture events by pointing out that the word hello was a word that was invented for technology. It actually came about because it was the greeting that people were going to use on the telephone. But I think the COVID-19 pandemic has itself brought a host of new language with it. I mean, who'd heard of furloughing until vast numbers of employees were put on furlough earlier in the year? I don't know what the word of 2020 is going to be, but lockdown must be a very serious contender. And just as the pandemic has changed our language, it has massively changed our culture and the way we consume it. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. As venues closed and many of us struggle finding ways, many of them still find viable ways of reopening, our culture consumption moved online and to the broadcast and to broadcast networks. So whether you were furloughed, working from home, a key worker coming home from that front line, we all gained comfort, stories, stimulation, entertainment, and inspiration from the national broadcaster. So that's why I'm so glad that we've got Jonty here with us today to find out more about how, in particular, the Culture in Quarantine programme came about, some of the thinking behind it, some of the responses we've had to it, and Jonty, what your plans are sort of going forward. But I guess to start at the beginning, can you tell us about the Culture in Quarantine programme in general, how it came about? And given that I think lockdown was announced on the Monday, the 23rd, and by the Wednesday, the 25th, you were announcing this season. Just, what an enormous achievement that was and how that came about.
Yeah, I think the big moment wasn't actual national lockdown. It was the moment the week before. It was the Monday night when Matt Hancock gave his speech, which in effect said that cultural venues, amongst other sorts of buildings and social spaces would need to close. At that time, the idea is that schools, etc., would still be open. But from the moment he gave that speech, and I think all of us as well had spent that previous few weeks with a very icky feeling about what was happening, the uncertainty. Those who get to work by public transport, we all had that feeling late in February, early March, sitting on trains or buses and thinking, this isn't right. This doesn't feel quite right. But on that Monday night, I think there were sort of three things that, as Hancock gave that speech, were just immediately obvious to me from that moment. And it's partly because outside my BBC work, I'm also chair of Home in Manchester, and so I'm often seeing things through the lens of what it means to be a regional arts organisation at the same time. But from that moment, I realised three things. The first was that what had been announced was going to be terrible for the cultural sector. And at that time, we didn't even think it was going to be longer than a month necessarily. But knowing how a lot of cultural organisations work, I felt or knew that a month could be potentially lethal to a lot of a lot of cultural organizations and freelance artists are running very close to the wire the whole time. They don't have much in the way of reserves or kind of backup funding. And so even just being closed for a month, I thought would potentially drive some organizations and individuals out of business. And at that time, we couldn't have even guessed or that it was going to be as long as it was. So it was clear something was going to need to happen. The second thing I felt was that for the public, this was going to be very significant. And I had I don't know about how other people on this meeting felt, but from the moment I heard our cultural centres were going to have to close, I had a very visceral feeling that was different to the way I think any of us think about culture normally. And reflecting on this, I think we've all got quite used to, as a sector, to talking about culture and the role of arts in our lives in a very particular way over the years, which is partly about how we communicate the importance of culture to stakeholders who aren't necessarily interested. So for a long time, we've talked about the economic values of culture. In recent years, we've emphasized well-being and health. But there was a third thing which I felt from the moment cultural centres were going to close down, which is much more wishy-washy and not very fashionable to talk about. But I think I think it's important for all of us as individuals in a time of national crisis to feel that we're part of something bigger than ourselves and even than our society at that moment. And I think culture has a kind of civilizational power to it. Culture is something that evolves and develops. You engage with Shakespeare, you engage with music from 200, 300 years ago. And I think that feeling that we're part of something longer and bigger than the current moment is where culture comes in. And I think a lot of people began to feel that as well. And it's something that we haven't talked about much in national discourse, because it gets you into it starts to sound a bit wishy-washy, and it gets you into quite uncomfortable language about what civilization means. But I think that was there for a lot of people. And I think that was later reflected in the way people began to, we know from reading habits, people were engaging with the classics or engaging with classical music. And then I think the sort of third thing was that realization from Matt Hancock's speech, was that in a way the BBC, because it was a virtual cultural organization, could play a very unique role during this time. So that very quickly the next day led to conversations with both Tony Hall, our Director General, about looking for the backing to do something, and also the other cultural functions within the BBC. And working with my team, by the end of that day, we'd sort of come to a pretty clear sense that the role of the BBC at this time was going to be twofold. One, it was going to be to ensure that the public could continue to have access to culture. and participate in culture, even if the spaces they traditionally went to weren't open at that time. And then secondly, that we were going to need to provide this service by working as generously and widely with the wider sector as possible to try and just ensure as much money and commissioning was being spread around. We decided to call it Culture in Quarantine almost immediately as well. And by the Wednesday, the next day, we were then able to announce what it was we were proposing. And Culture in Quarantine itself was effectively bringing together all of the BBC's different cultural functions under a single purpose, under a single brand. So it became a messaging and a function that we used across our different cultural services. So that's the long-winded origin story.
Thank you. We've just while you've been talking, there's been some slides in the background. Currently, we have a slide of it's 5 people. One a black man drinking some tea out of a mug. I recognise Mira Sayala up in the corner. And people peering into the camera and in clearly much more domestic settings. I wanted to pick up on your last point about the BBC as the nation's broadcaster, because I imagine that as the national broadcaster, there were a number of protocols that already existed. I'm guessing you've got one for, I was going to say if the Queen dies, but when the Queen dies, there must be I'm guessing there's something, if there's a sort of national disaster. Was there any protocol at any point? Was there any protocol or standing idea for what one might do in this situation? And then in the absence of that, it does sound like what you were going to do was champion some of the work that had been happening in venues that were no longer available to people. But really, just so back to the first bit, really, is that was there any protocol, any precedent for any of this, or were you literally creating in the moment?
The BBC has protocols around national emergencies, but this was so specific, and you've got to do the right things according to the context and the circumstance you're in. So what the BBC does have is a protocol for how it will quickly react to a national emergency, and that's why the BBC was so quick in its response to what it was going to be doing during lockdown, not just culturally, but across the board. And my announcements around Culture in Quarantine were part of a larger messaging. So there was a machinery that kicked into action very, very quickly, which was senior leaders coming together and starting to work out how we would adapt to it. But the specifics of this being a pandemic, that it was going to involve a lockdown. Nobody knew what a lockdown would actually mean on a daily basis, and you don't know what is therefore right for the public, what the public is going to need, other than sort of clear information. So we were working out the details and the functions of Culture in Quarantine on the spot on the day itself, but I think what we had was a kind of a national emergency procedure by which we were able to get things agreed very, very quickly.
So to use a kind of lockdown analogy, I wondered, there was quite an emphasis on theatre. There was some really amazing people involved, RSC, Bridge, some performances from Northern Ballet, BRB, and also some smaller companies such as Vamos, the deaf theatre practitioner Kathy Mager. It seemed to me to be a mixture of possibly store cupboard items, things that you had already, as well as sort of topping up with fresh things, a bit like the commissions, I guess you could say. Was the focus on theatre particularly because that they were the venues who were most obviously affected, and what was the importance of the commissions in the strategy?
Yeah, so while we knew Culture in Quarantine was essentially about two things, about ensuring continuing access for the public to culture, but doing so through a process of collaboration and sharing, we also knew that what the content strategy was going to be what we called acquire, collate, but also create. So we wanted to acquire things. We talked about setting up a repertory theatre for the nation at a time when the theatres were closed. We also, the collating point was about it was immediately clear lots of activity was happening across the cultural sector, and we wanted a place to bring that together. There's a sort of bearing witness function at a time of national emergency. I think the BBC has an important part to play in. And so we repurposed the BBC Arts Digital site into a culture in quarantine site, and essentially anything we could see going on, we just linked to there, and we said to the sector, just send us anything you're doing. We're going to start to create a kind of place where it can be found. But then also, it was very important we would find ways of still creating, whatever that, however difficult that that got. So in that first week, I began talking to some of the museums about doing a museums in quarantine series, which we eventually did for BBC4. In that first week, when it was post social spaces have to close down, but we're not in a state of national lockdown, my plan was to get small crews into museums. By 2 weeks later, it was clear we couldn't even do that. There was a with Swan TV, who I was doing the project with, we just had a sense that we had to find a way of doing this, whatever it took. And in the end, we got to a place where we could agree with museums for the security guards, because all the museum, the curatorial staff were either furloughed or at home, but the security guards would let in a single camera operator who would, and that was it, only one person could go in. And so we then approached art historians to then write scripts based on museum collections or exhibitions, and effectively direct the camera operator through the museum. So at its most basic, it got down to that level. We also had Mary Beard's BBC Two show, Front Row Late, which we brought earlier in the schedules and renamed Lockdown Culture. And that was due to start in April anyway. And there was a question about, are we going to have to just park the show? And then we got into we're just going to have to do it on Mary's iPhone from her study at home, and we're just going to have to find a way to do it. So that was a show made on an iPhone 11, effectively. So that creation had that need to keep creating was symbolically very, very important. And of course, what we were finding is that a lot of other cultural organizations were finding their own ways to keep making. So we wanted to reflect that as well. You mentioned theatre earlier, and I should say that theatre wasn't meant to be the main function. We identified 6 kind of purposes of culture in quarantine, and one was supporting the performing arts, so music, theatre, dance, as well as festivals, so book festivals. Another was around repertory theatre, about acquiring things and putting things onto iPlayer so that audiences could just find things easily. And so we were then talking to the RSC and Globe about putting together a Shakespeare package for Shakespeare's birthday, April the 20th. We decided our third function was around museums and shuttered museums and exhibitions, and finding ways to get inside museums and exhibitions. The fourth function was around reportage and bearing witness, so keeping Front Row Radio going, keeping Mary Beard's show going, getting the Culture in Quarantine site running. The fifth priority was around artist funding, and we immediately got into conversations with funders in each of the nations around the artist funding schemes. We can come to that later. And the sixth thing was about participation, how the public who are at home and needed activities could start to get involved in making things as well. But so it wasn't intended that theatre would become so dominant, but I think and in a way, classical music, what was happening around classical music was just as dominant as well. But I think theatre had a symbolic importance to it. Again, and it was not only that audiences weren't going to be able to access theatres, and a lot of people do go to theatres. I think there's something about theatre which it's a very reactive art form, and one of the most reactive. You know, if you're composing a symphony or writing a novel, that can be years in the work, but theatre is very effective at dealing with things as they're happening and making sense of what we're going through. So theatre began to emerge as an art form that was really, if our health services were and our scientists were trying to deal with COVID medically, theatre was one of the art forms that was trying to make sense of COVID existentially, about what it meant, what it was we were going through. And that's why, and that's what theatre makers do. So I think it was more we were reacting to a theatre sector that was just very active at that time. It was dealing with the kind of realities of having to furlough staff and shut its buildings, but also just wanting to make work. And that was an irresistible offer then to be working with.
Yeah, so I love that analogy that, you know, the scientists were out there working out what was happening. The scientists and the NHS were out there working out what's happening biologically. You know, Rishi Sunak's working out what's happening economically, but the theatre and culture was trying to work out what was going on emotionally, and music, as you say, was a big part of that. I want to particularly talk about some of the commissions and give people a minor break from this screen to maybe focus on a clip, because I'm going to move us to a specific project that was commissioned, I think as part of the Culture in Quarantine collaboration with the Space Arts, and we can talk about it after the clip. But really, and that was Corey Baker's Swan Lake in the Bath. We'll go to the clip in just a moment, but here to me absolutely sums up all sorts of things that could only have happened in quarantine. A global cast of prima ballerinas, a piece of ballet that has been made in a domestic setting with people's, as you say, iPhones and smartphones, and yet something truly unique, and the gift of an idea that even in lockdown we can make something beautiful like this. So if we can run the clip, we'll be running this clip for about 3 minutes long. Enjoy, everybody. Thank you. I do urge, if you've not seen that before, looks like from the chat, some of you, that's the first time you've had a chance to enjoy that. That is available on the Culture in Quarantine part of iPlayer. I'm aware certainly that there's been millions of views of this on platforms like Facebook. How did it come about, and what do you know about the impact? You know, what are you aware of in terms of audience impact for this and some of the other clips?
So one of the first things we did with Culture in Quarantine was try and find ways. We sort of knew that the BBC could work with bigger organisations, right? That's something we do very easily. But it was obvious as well that some of the worst impacted was going to be individuals, freelance artists, and makers. So on those first few days, I reached out to Arts Council England, and we talked about setting up a creative media fund, which we called the Culture in Quarantine Fund. And I also spoke to colleagues in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and we began to do similar things there, which I think come up later, but the Splendid Isolation with the Lyric in Northern Ireland, and then Scenes for Survival with National Theatre Scotland. But the Culture in Quarantine Fund was, I've never known the BBC and the Arts Council work so quickly together. We had the whole thing agreed and announced and taking submissions within about 10 days. Our idea was simply to kind of, it was basically just to try and keep some commissioning and funding going out to independents, but we also liked the idea it would form a snapshot, that it would form a cultural snapshot of the moment we'd gone through. I didn't know what to expect from those projects, and I sort of went into them thinking, let's just keep some money and commissioning flowing out. And I thought, who knows what will come in, because the ability to do anything is so limited. So I didn't have particularly high expectations of what was going to be made. But then collectively, I've been completely knocked out by the overall quality of these individual commissions. And it's been one of the most significant kind of learning things for me out of this whole time. But I mean, Corey Baker's Swan Lake Bath Ballet was just a sort of brilliant, splashy idea. It was made using dancers in every continent around the world. Corey directed it from his own bathroom in the UK. There are kind of great stories of the dancers, having to use sort of children's scooters or a toilet plunger to kind of prop up their iPhones in the right places. But as you can see, it's it's actually very simple. It's just iPhones, everything done remotely at the height of lockdown. But it's just an extraordinary, joyful and inventive project. It's had at the moment around over 6 million views. So for a dance film, effectively, that's extraordinary. So I mean, I think Corey's the Swan Lake Bath Ballet has a very broad appeal, and as well many of the projects that came out of the Culture and Quarantine Fund and Splendid Isolation and Scenes for Survival are just extraordinary, particularly around dance as well. I think dance and film has kind of gone through an amazing turning point over the last 6 months.
So a little bit earlier, you also mentioned another strand was that the nation would be participating, that they would be engaging with culture, not simply as passive consumers, watchers on devices and televisions, but they would have access to art forms that maybe they wouldn't otherwise try out. So you could say people were trapped at home, but one of the things I wanted to talk about was something like life drawing live, an idea that has been done in other ways in pre-lockdown, but do you think it took on a whole new relevance, post-lockdown, and when people were at home, not necessarily aching to fill their time, but there's something particularly contemplative, quite calming about life drawing. If you've ever been in a class, it's can be quite a Zen experience. Do you think that attributed to some of its take up, and what do you know about its take up?
We're pretty sure that the public appetite for participation in the arts rocketed during the time of lockdown. We were very lucky in that we've been a central partner for the last 5 years in a national campaign called Get Creative, which is about encouraging and celebrating participation in the arts. So we had a ready-made structure. And so when lockdown happened, it was immediately obvious that Get Creative's time was now. And Stephen James Yeoman, who runs the BBC side of it, just immediately went into action. He set up the Get Creative masterclasses, very simply done, artists at home showing how they do things. One example, Anthony Gormley did a kind of drawing class for half an hour. It's probably the most intimate portrayal of a great artist like Gormley you'll see. And one interesting thing is that the very nature of lockdown meant that there was a kind of greater informality in the way artists were engaging with audiences. And so funnily enough, I think that masterclass that Gormley did is the sort of thing that has an archival value in that 60 years time, when students want to know what Anthony Gormley was like. Having this homemade clip of him doing a drawing class is kind of extraordinary. But Live Drawing Live was, as you say, it was something we'd done earlier in the year, which on BBC4 that people loved. And so we said, let's do it again. And it was a real challenge because it was the first, although we were doing single camera shoots or sort of homemaking, Live Drawing Live was effectively a live studio show. So it took a lot of planning in order to do it safely. And when you look at it, I'm not sure if you can see it in the pictures, the whole set design had to reflect the rules of social distancing, the way things are marked out on the floor, the way it's lit. It's essentially an aesthetic led by social distancing. What was extraordinary is that it was at the same time as the show was going on, we had the kind of pose cam going on red button, so you could press red button and just look at the model and draw. It was the first time we've ever had as many people looking purely at the red button as watching the live show. So that was really significant. And then also in the 4 hours from when it started, over 26,000 people uploaded the pictures they'd done in response, which seemed to us, which was completely sort of mind-blowing. It almost crashed the server. So if that was over 26,000 pictures being sent in, there are probably many more that people...
Yes, you are people. That literally is the tip of the iceberg. We have a slide at the moment of a lovely sketch, a pencil sketch of a seated nude woman with her arm across her chest, and it's signed Sandra Newcastle 2020. And so part of that, the other thing about showing things are, as you say, with the digital enhancement, the red button, the iPlayer, you have very immediate feedback stats in a way that, previously we didn't, many years ago, you didn't have in broadcasting. You waited for the radar figures or whatever. So what did you sort of tweak? Watching those things, did that inform how it went along? Did you tweak as you go? I know that, well, Culture in Quarantine is now extended, and it would appear that certain lockdown, maybe not full lockdown, but there's certainly many of our restrictions have been extended. What do you think? What was the reaction to the feedback, and how has that informed what's going forward? I suppose that's the best way to put it.
Well, to be honest, we don't know a great deal about yet about which audiences were engaging. It's the usual data we have, which is overnights and looking at hits and clicks and so on. So it's actually, I don't think we have the nuance that that you think that we do. I think there are a couple of things we know. We know that across the board, people were consuming more, and the BBC as an organisation saw a fundamental shift in audience behaviour, from moving faster from linear to on demand, and that we think is a permanent behaviour change now that has been fueled by lockdown. We did, on the art side, we did find an increased demand through social. So the Swan Lake Bath Ballet, which you referred to, most of the reach is through social. And so bearing in mind the demographics of those who predominantly use social, we think we may have been engaging more with younger audiences, different audiences, but we can't for definite say that. I think the thing we do know is that there is a real desire, public desire, to participate and feel involved in and culture. So I think we learnt overall there were more people watching. So I think we know that the public is more interested in arts and culture than we've previously realized, if it's presented in the right way, if it feels a bit informal, if it feels like something they can participate in. And I think that's the biggest learning here, is that when arts and culture feels like something that is shared, that you have a stake in, you have a role in, the audience appetite surges. But because that was what lockdown did, it's what culture in quarantine by necessity did. Everything just became a bit more informal and a bit more fluid. And I think the public audience has responded to that really well.
Yes, I think maybe there's lots of, certainly I'm just going to flag up briefly the panel this afternoon, which is going to discuss a variety of cultural institutions and what they did during lockdown, and in particular how they moved an offer online in different ways and got different feedback. I think that will be that will be a massive lesson, not just for the BBC, but for everybody. We are taking questions. I have some already. I'm going to move to them in just a second, but do put them in the chat if you have any more. My first question is about, you may only be able to talk about generally, because I don't know if it's necessarily your specialty, but it's from Jasmine Morton, who asks, did the BBC put more cultural educational resources in place? And will they do so again? Sort of the idea of the second wave. I'm not sure whether that means as part of your education output, or I think more of this participation type work. So is there plans for more so in the light that we may be having a second or maybe even a third wave?
Yeah, so we did at the time, in that BBC 4 at the time turned over several hours of the day into putting on content that supported the syllabus. And in that, we were one of the reasons why we took the in setting up the repertory of theatre on iPlayer, we were also following the syllabus. We were very keen to get play titles that were in the syllabus, and we did, and we put them there. I think we're reacting now, aren't we, very quickly to the winter we're going into. So while we hoped that we were on a kind of slow trajectory but of everything just gradually easing, it's now clear that's not the case. And I think we started a conversation on Monday this week about the syllabus again, that actually if it is going to be if it's going to stay very, very difficult to get into theatres, people may not feel comfortable about going into theatres, we need to start looking at the syllabus again and looking at how we provide a similar service.
Another question, have you found that BBC Sounds has been beneficial as a platform for arts content? You mentioned classical music earlier. I'm wondering whether Sounds was a particular vehicle for that.
That's a good question. We were, most of what we were doing was going through the linear the live stations and then on to Sounds. And I don't know if arts content on Sounds itself specifically picked up during that time. I'd need to check.
Do you think people, so this is a question, and I think it does relate back to something you said right at the end, that do you think people were engaging more because of that sort of increased access? This person, I'm sorry, I don't have your name. It says, I don't think I know I wouldn't have seen the Titian exhibition without the documentary. And I think, yes, and I might just add this next one on, just so I can get a couple in. And do you think that the increase in free arts engagement has or will affect how much people are willing to pay for the arts? So I'm guessing part of going to a Titian exhibition, if you don't live there, is the travel, there's possibly accommodation. There isn't just the cost of, sometimes, there's not just the cost of the event itself. So do you think people are engaging more because of increased access? And given the increased access, do you think that's going to have an effect on the sort of wider cultural ecology in terms of payment?
Yeah, so I do think, once again, I don't have hard data other than just looking at the sort of general pickup and surge in certain titles on the BBC. But I do think that free access, increased access, I mean, not leaving the BBC aside for one moment, the National Theatre, I mean, they, when they put the NT Live projects free online, and they've had millions upon millions of people who have watched them. So that's a case in point. But I think there's been an element of that for lots of different organisations. So I think free access does increase engagement, certainly. In terms of whether that affects or damages the business model, I personally don't believe that. I believe that if you stimulate a passion for arts in people, they just want to consume more. It's like any sort of product or creation. Once people get a bug for it, then they just want more, and they're willing to pay more for it. So I would suspect that a lot of people, some of the people watching the NT Lives, may not be regular theatre goers at all, and could well become so as a result of this. So I never worry about doing something for free damage the market, because I think you're just stimulating an appetite in people for them to prioritise spending money on culture.
Another one from Jasmine. Could someone explain how views on something like Facebook equate to money or funding or income? So I guess, does counting the views count as audience member participation, and is passive watching enough? I'm sure as a broadcaster you'll say passive watching is more than enough, but I guess there's something about that correlation between, well, if somebody watches it on Facebook, is that not as it were, valuable to you as somebody watching it on iPlayer or any other platform? And how does that, and is there a tie-in to money or funding and income?
I hope, I'm not sure if I've got the question right, but certainly it's great that people, I mean, Swan Lake Bath Ballet, I think, got most of its views through Facebook. That's great. I think the only way in which it's different for us at the BBC is that the data we have about how people are consuming things on, say, Facebook is vaguer for us. So our data about through the overnights is much more specific. You can sort of see when people switch off, and when it comes to kind of clicks and hits, you often don't know how long somebody really stays watching something for, or how engaged they are. But we get to know that a bit more through the audience data set up through the BBC and the way that's structured. So I always feel a bit more confident in knowing knowing how people might have watched or consumed something based on the BBC data, because it's more sophisticated. We have more available to us. I think that's answered half the question. I'm not sure what the other half was.
Well, I think there was a sort of a notion that, and I think it might be difficult in the BBC because it's about whether those high figures equate to income or funding for you. But as a funded broadcaster, that's a slightly different thing. You're not you know, you're not putting.
Yes, they don't really. I don't think. No.
Yeah. I've got one last question from the panel, and I'll wrap in my final question, because that this is quite specific, and so it's saying, how, I'm afraid I don't have the name again, sorry, but how can I approach BBC Arts with a film based on mental health AVM survivors that we completed during lockdown? It is already reaching an audience in America, Europe, and England. But I suppose I would just tag on to that as a final question. We are going to have some restrictions for some time. Culture in Quarantine as a season is continuing. How might somebody get in touch with you about product, you know, about something they might have an interest in, film during lockdown? And will there be another Culture in Quarantine type set of commissions?
So the first bit is just to email me. So at the start of Culture in Quarantine, I made the decision just to kind of shove out my email address, and my inbox just became.
Yes.
But that was fine, and actually it was very useful for me to kind of keep an eye on everything. So my email address is jonty.claypole@bbc.co.uk, and I will get back eventually. In terms of the Culture in Quarantine, but the sort of fund commissions, yes, we're shaping that at the moment, but some form of it is almost certainly coming back quite soon. We're just shaping what that is, particularly with other potential partners. But I'm very keen, particularly bearing in mind the announcements this week, that we and particularly bearing in mind the quality of the work that was done, which I think is sort of game changing, that we find a way to keep that momentum. Yeah,
thank you. Sorry, that last question actually was from Tom Tyrrell. So hello, Tom. I know Tom from before. So yes, you heard it here, jonty.claypole@bbc.co.uk. I'm really conscious of time. We have about 3 minutes. So I've got 2 more questions. That's going to be really tricky. It's going to be a 1-minute answer, I fear. How are we working? It says, hi, Jonty and Helga, thanks for a great session. How are we working with the regions and other countries across the UK? You mentioned already a collaboration with, the other nations. We've worked with great producing theatres like BAC previously. Is there an opportunity to work with regional producing houses to do similar? I'm sorry, I haven't got a context for that because I don't know who the question's from. And do you think, I'm going to wrap these up as well, and do you think that going forward, post-COVID, that the BBC will keep harnessing and using this more informal mode of viewing and creating to kind of continue with that accessible engagement with the arts industries? So question about regions and questions about that informality. Do you think that's going to last?
Yeah, so first point, we were from the start very conscious to make Culture in Quarantine not a metropolitan thing. So we got straight in doing projects with the nations and also regional companies as well. And through those projects, a lot of them are non-London, are out of London, and regional projects or from the nations. In terms of the informality, I think yes. I think I think there are 2 things to bear in mind. I think one is the audience appetite is probably getting fairly limited now on monologues delivered to a phone screen, and
the aesthetic that you mentioned.
I think we're going to. I think what we can't do is sit still and just say let's just do more of what we were doing in lockdown. I think we're going to have to keep evolving it, because if the audience appetite starts to feel a bit sated, that they've kind of seen that. So and then the informality, I think it's a question for the wider sector as much as anything else, because I've never found it easier to work with other organisations than it was in the first 2 months of lockdown. Everyone just got over themselves, and everyone was shaped on the greater good, not worrying too much about building their own brands, etc., etc. Everyone got the lawyers away slightly. And it was an amazing time for that reason. So I like it. So I like working that way, and I want to keep working that way. And I think it's a question for the whole sector as well, because I think what came out of it was was that the kind of public felt it as well, and felt they were being welcomed in more, that they were being treated, that they were seeing a more informal side of a sector that can at times feel a little bit removed and pompous. So I think it's a challenge for everyone, is about how do we keep that kind of informality at the same time as everyone is obsessing and fretting about, you know, IP and legal matters. It's a real challenge.
Yes. I'm tempted to say, like Shakespeare did, first kill all the lawyers, but I won't, not least because I'm married to one. Okay, thank you so much. I know we're out of time now, but it really has been fascinating. Excuse me, talking to you today. Thank you so much for sharing with us. I'd like to issue a big thanks to Lara and Chris, who are programme curators of Hello Culture, and everyone at the BBC Academy, especially Shirley. This is part of the Digital Cities programme. Make sure that you check out the virtual Digital Cities website. There's masterclasses and more from Hello Culture after a lunch break. Katie Rains from Indigo, 250,000 people she has now surveyed across the country, looking at what culture people were consuming during lockdown, of which obviously Culture in Quarantine was a major part. But we'll be finding out how teams from the Manchester International Festival, the Donmar Warehouse, Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery all coped with programming during lockdown. There's already been a link in the chat, but please do join us. I'll be in the audience for that too after the break. Jonty, thank you so much for giving us your time, and thank you all. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.